Hi, it's Rob Bryanton, and this is my video blog entry for November 14th, 2007 for Imagining the 10th Dimension. As I usually try and say at the start of these shows, if you're watching right now at 10thdimension.com/chat, you're probably watching a pre-recorded show, but the text that's scrolling down underneath me is being generated live, and which means that anybody who's watching the show can have that become part of what other people who are watching the video right now, wherever they're watching it, it becomes part of that. And we do check the logs from time to time. I'm going to refer a little bit later in this particular program to some of the stuff that's been posted to the chat logs in the last week. But the reason I mentioned that there are other ways to watch this show is because if you're at Ustream.tv, for instance, there's also a chat that's happening there. That doesn't get incorporated into the video that we're watching, but it does get viewed from the 10thdimension.com/chat window, so people can actually talk back and forth between those two or comment on what each other are saying between those two. It's a very multi-dimensional way to be able to exchange these ideas back and forth, and I hope people enjoy playing with those ideas. Another way that you could be watching this is just at 10thdimension.tv. If you'd just like to sit back and watch the show without participating in the conversations, that's another way to watch it. If you'd like to explore some of the other ideas that are peripheral to this, if you're at 10thdimension.com/chat, this is Amiibo window, which means over to the right, anybody who posts a YouTube link or a link to a website, that becomes part of the thumbnails over to the right. If you've already seen this show, or if you're sick of hearing me blab on, go ahead and turn the volume down on me in this left-hand window and talk about some of the things that are happening over to the right. So the blog entry that I'm going to read you today is actually in response to what somebody wrote into the chat window, saying that I was taking the ideas of Richard Dawkins and completely subverting them. Richard Dawkins, of course, developed the concept of memes in the first place, and a meme being an idea that has a shape in time and space, a beginning and an ending, an idea that can be transmitted across time and space with no dilution. Richard Dawkins came up with that idea. I'd say right now, as we're becoming more and more connected together through Google and through Wikipedia and the internet, memes are becoming something that it gets easier and easier to track as it rises and falls. But if you're thinking in a multi-dimensional way, as we've been encouraging people to do here, it's just another pattern in the nature of reality. And the idea I'm exploring today then is whether we can say God is in the seventh dimension. And before those of you who support the Richard Dawkins concept of God is a dangerous idea that we should all try to suppress as much as possible because it has been responsible for too many bad things in history, all I'm really trying to do is get to the point where we can acknowledge that God is part of this way of imagining reality. I'm not saying it's the proof that God does exist. I'm not saying it's the proof that God doesn't exist. I'm saying this is another way of thinking about it, and what we're trying to do is find a way to fit all the various truths of the world together. And I know that may seem like an impossible task, but since I'm not a physicist, I'm a composer, I'm interested in the creative exploration of ideas, and the motto for this site has been everything fits together, and that's what we're exploring here. So I'm going to read that blog entry for you now. Is God in the seventh dimension? The 10th Dimension site is averaging 2 million hits a month now. The meme that was set in motion since this project was launched in the summer of 2006 keeps growing as people continue to view the animation, read the book, and discuss these ideas around the world. By far the most viewed and most discussed question at the 10th Dimension forum has been this: is God in the 10th dimension? Other topics rise and fall in popularity from week to week, as memes often do, but this deep question is the one that people keep coming back to with their own unique views on the matter. I've put my own 2 bits in from time to time, but the discussions there have been passionate and widely varied, and this is all that I'm interested in doing here, promoting the discussion of ideas. Regular visitors to this blog or the forum will know that this is the idea I advance in my book. If we're imagining that our universe comes from an indeterminate quantum state, and that, as quantum physicists say, information equals reality, then everything is just patterns in that information. What's wrong with giving those patterns a name? But the corollary to that idea has to be to accept that calling what we're thinking about God makes some people uncomfortable. Giving the exact same thing a name that they're comfortable with doesn't change what we're talking about, it just changes the name. Since I'm such a fan of Richard Dawkins, I say this knowing full well that what I'm proposing here flies directly in the face of his book, The God Delusion. Sorry about that, Dr. Dawkins. Ultimately, asking if God is specifically in the 10th dimension is not the point of these discussions. What we're really talking about is whether there is a way for the ideas of spirituality and science to coexist, each acknowledging that ultimately they're talking about the same thing. But this time, let's work through the framework for discussion that I've advanced for how to visualize the dimensions and see where God works as a name for the pattern that created our universe. The 10th dimension, as I portrayed it, is the timeless void of quantum fields, the unobserved whole that is outside the system, and therefore unimaginable to us from within the system. Seems like a good place for an omnipotent being, and in the sense that God can be all things to all people, and that God can be thought of as the summation of everything that is and ever shall be, this is an obvious place to start. The only fly in the ointment here, I think, is that any attempt to observe any aspect of the 10th dimension spills us into the reality of the dimensions below. So, if we leave God up in the 10th dimension exclusively, I would say that we're imagining a God who never actually does anything. And as I've said before, imagining the all vibrations simultaneously / white light of the 10th dimension by itself is really the most boring part of the discussion. Another discussion that has happened recently at the forum is whether the 10th dimension, as I portrayed it, should be called a dimension at all, since what I'm really saying is that the 10th dimension can be thought of as the entirety of the 9th dimension, but viewed as a single point of indeterminate size. A visitor named Alyssa argued that this is deceptive, and other visitors to the forum then suggested that she think of dimensions 1 through 9 as each being an additional layer of an onion. To which I added the Zen-like idea that we could think then of the 9th dimension as being what happens when you look at the entire onion, and the 10th as being what happens when you don't look at the onion. Clearly, imagining something that is unobservable is tricky, whether you're talking about the indeterminate fields of quantum mechanics, or whether you're talking about God. But if we're portraying a God who causes absolutely everything to happen, then the 9th dimension would certainly be a place for him or her to be. My way of visualizing the dimensions suggests that the 9th, 8th, and 7th dimensions show us how to imagine the big picture memes that organize the information that eventually becomes reality. From the 9th down to the 7th, the ways of expressing energy and mass are gradually narrowed down until we arrive at our unique universe as an unwavering point in the 7th dimension. In my previous blog entry, How to Make a Universe, I touched on one of the ideas from my book. If the multiverse contains 10 to the power of 500 other universities, which is a possibility inferred from string theory, some of those other universes would be much less stable than our own, instantly exploding into nothingness or collapsing back in upon themselves. So here's another possible location for God. We might be imagining that out of all the possible universes, God chose to create the one we're in because he/she prefers creativity over destruction, life over no life, order over disorder, and so on. Are those phrases also big picture memes, ways of organizing the information that becomes our reality? Sure. But the question then becomes, if those other less productive universes do really exist out there within the universe, did our God create them? Or are there other gods out there who created those other universes because of their own preference for a different kind of universe than the one we live in? A pantheon of gods, both benevolent and malevolent, spring to mind then. A distasteful idea to some, an appealing idea to others. What about the 5th dimension? If our universe of space-time is being constructed one frame at a time by quanta that are each one Planck length away from the next, then I propose that the probability space of the next available branches is contained within the 5th rather than the 4th dimension. This means that as we're constructing what feels like a fourth dimensional line of time, we're actually twisting and turning in the fifth dimension, which gives us a way to imagine how this fifth dimension and above could appear to be curled up down at the Planck length for us, and yet those higher dimensions could also contain the astonishingly large concept of the multiverse filled with universes, which we've come to imagine. If everything from the beginning of time within our specific universe is the result of an observation of the quantum wave function, then the fifth dimension looks like a great location to place God, and to see how we're all connected together through the consensual reality that we share. Each is our own quantum observer. In other words, the combined quantum observer effect that creates our universe right from the Big Bang to now could be God. As I say in my book, the reader may notice here that it would be very easy to substitute God or the Creator in place of the observer in the above paragraphs. In fact, if the reader is comfortable with the concept of each of us being an expression of God, created in his or her image, each with a holy spark within, then the two viewpoints are quite compatible. On the other hand, though, the image of a God who is separate from, standing in judgment of, and meting out punishment to us all is much less compatible. What we're describing here is a reality where each of us is creating an expression of a specific aspect inferred within the white noise of the 10th dimension through our individual roles as quantum observers. If the reader finds it's easier to accept the phrase, "I am an aspect of God," than they do the previous sentence, then they should feel free to use that as their jumping off point instead. As we discussed before, the 10th dimension, as we're conceptualizing it here, is really the boring part of our discussion because it simultaneously contains all possibilities. If we choose to imagine a creator God who is manifesting himself or herself through each one of us, we are imagining an observer who is cutting cross-sections out of the 10th dimension to examine the much more interesting and highly detailed subsets of reality which are contained within the dimensions below. Okay, and back to the blog. People who say that God works in mysterious ways, and that what feels like bad luck may actually be a part of God's master plan, would be fine with leaving God in the fifth dimension. Personally, here's where I stand with that idea. Try as I might, I can't imagine a God who has deliberately created a world that allows evil and inequity to exist as part of his or her plan. Is there a force for destruction and selfishness and chaos that helps to make our world less beautiful than it could be? For any specific universe, I have placed all the timelines that could potentially have existed, but some of which are now unavailable because of what has come before or what comes after, out in the sixth dimension. And if we're going to imagine that there are forces doing battle to create the world we live in, then that battle must be raging in the sixth dimension. The good guys don't always win, and bad luck happens to the best of us, which would mean the chaos and deliberately chosen paths that cause one part of our world to prosper while so many others suffer is part of the temptations and bad choices that each of us have to acknowledge exist out there in the sixth dimension for our specific universe. Which leads me back to the seventh dimension. If God is the pattern that created the world and the universe we live in, I think that's the best place to find him or her. But I can see arguments for placing God in other dimensions, including the 10th, or even across all dimensions, depending on your own point of view. There's a couple of videos that were attached to the blog, which we're not going to watch in the video blog today, but they are called The Unseen Eye and What Was Done Today. And I encourage you to do searches for those videos as well if you'd like to see some of the other explorations that I got into in talking about those ideas, or if you just search at 10thdimension.com/blog for the blog entry that is called "Is God in the Seventh Dimension?" You'll find those videos appended to that blog. So right now then I'm going to go back, just close the window I'm in right now, and talk a little bit more about some of the ideas that people have been exploring in the chat logs. Moving on then from, I was talking last time about some of the ideas that John got into, and John's really an amazing guy. He gets into some discussions here in this chat window that I encourage the rest of you to join in with, because he's got an amazing mind for putting connections together that most of us would probably benefit from exploring with him. I was about a week before the blog entry that we just read. I was talking with him about the songs that I had written for this, and how this had started out 20 years ago for me as an exploration of the nature of reality. And at that point, I was working on a science fiction play with a playwright. I was writing the music for it, and I tried to convince him that the what I've learned in the last few years, the many worlds version of reality, that was what I was trying to convey to people 20 years ago. The branching possibilities that exist across the fifth and sixth dimension can all be joined together as a single point in the seventh dimension. And but also the music that I wrote for that play was based upon the system of tens that I've been experimenting with, and that means that if you look at a guitar, there are 12 frets from the first note up to the octave. I had a guitar constructed that only had 10 frets, which meant that that all of the notes that defined the music that was created for that show sounded completely different and somewhat alien. It was like music from another universe. I also experimented with 10 beats to the bar and 10 subdivisions to the beat in the music, and it was a fun exploration that I'd still like to get into as some of the ways that we can and explore some of the ideas that are part of this way of subdividing reality into 10 dimensions. So I'm just going to flip here to the next page and see some of the other discussions that have happened over the next while. Somebody says, "Oh yes, this is the quote I already referred to." Somebody calling themselves Flat Earther complained about me trying to misappropriate Professor Dawkins' work, and they say, "The science of this is a bit reductionist. That sort of wishy-washy, if you believe it, it's true for you nonsense is very troublesome. Are we proposing that time is nonlinear?" And then a couple minutes later they say, "That's enough. What a misrepresentation of Professor Dawkins' work. That's what you get for writing science in a flowery light." And they left the room. I embrace that just as much as any other viewpoint. If your belief system is not willing to acknowledge that there could be anything other than the reality we see before us, then that would be a representation of what this person calling them Flat Earther, odd choice for a name, would have been expressing there. Somebody writes in and asks some technical questions about how we're doing the green screening, and that's something we can talk a little bit more about. We're using a program called CamTwist to create this show, and that's how the text that's scrolling underneath is being added into the video. That's how the stuff that's being superimposed over, and that's how the green screen that goes to air is being created. We're also recording this show to high definition, and CamTwist only does a lower resolution version of it. So that version we're using some other programs to be able to generate it. But by all means, if you're interested in creating streaming shows, CamTwist is a great program. It's available free of charge. You can download it. We downloaded it and did send a donation to the author of the program, but the author doesn't guarantee any sort of tech support. He's doing it as his own little passionate creation, and we encourage you to support him. But saying so, we still acknowledge that he's just creating the program for his own use and his own entertainment. He's sharing it with the world free of charge, and if you'd like to do that, we can encourage you to do so. Somebody else writes on and says, why is the little girl singing this song? Some people who might be new to this project or may not be aware that we just finished doing a karaoke contest where we encourage people to go to YouTube, find the karaoke versions of there's 6 songs up there that are part of the 26 song collection that is associated with this site, and just as part of the creative exploration, we encouraged people to, for a $500 prize, send their videos in, and the winning video is the one that they're referring to there. We're going to be running another contest in a little while, but that's still being worked on. Somebody the next day writes in, this is one book I'd like to read, but I can't afford another bloody book. Damn college textbooks. And somebody writes back, laughing out loud to that. I should mention that if you're not interested in spending too much money and you'd still like to read the book, there is a PDF downloadable version which is considerably cheaper than the hard copy or the soft cover version of the book. And that's another thing you can find if you go to 10thdimension.com/digital. There's also other versions of the materials that are associated with this project available there. The animation is available as a downloadable file, and the songs are available as downloadable MP3s. So that leads us up to the stuff that was happening the day of this video blog. And once again, John has a couple hours here of stuff that he's saying. Some of it related to the conspiracy theories and the fact that there may be some other things happening behind the scenes that that are responsible for how we ended up in the reality we're in right now. So he also talks about the concept of bings, which is something that is in one of the TED Talks videos that is posted in the Meebo chat room. Something definitely that if you'd like to explore another way of thinking about consciousness and how it relates to our creation of the reality that we're all witness to. The suggestion in that one is that that every instant where our consciousness interacts with the reality around us could be called a bing, and that consciousness is generally in about 30 to 90 bings per second, which is an interesting idea. So I'm going to wrap the show up now, and we're going to look at one of the songs that was created for this project that identifies the fact that if we're talking about our own universe, really the seventh dimension is as far as you need to go, because everything else above that is not part of the reality that was defined for us in the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th dimension. Everything gets locked in at the 7th dimension, and in string theory and brain theory, the suggestion is that that our reality is created by a three-dimensional brain interacting with a seven-dimensional brain. Possibly related concept, could be just a coincidence too. I'm not trying to lay claim to that one. I think it's a very, very interesting coincidence now. So this song, 7 Levels, takes us through the concepts that are presented in the first 7 levels of the Imagining the 10th Dimension animation as well, and places it into terms that are a little more musical. So this is Rob Bryanton. See you again here at Imagining the 10th Dimension. Bye for now.
Paul announced it with a gleam in his eye. Timothy found it written on high. Sanskrit mystics, chakras too. Everybody says it, so it must be true. There are 7 levels, levels to the universe. 7 levels, from 7 down to the first. The point, a singularity, impossibly small, as in geometry, no width or depth. A place to start, imaginary construct, the very first part. Then comes a line, the first dimensionality, the simple way, from point A to B. The second is a branch, from one line to another, a splitting apart. It's easy to discover there are 7 levels, levels to the universe. 7 levels, 7 down to the first. Jump to another 2. 3 is space. The world we live in, everything in every place. Now you find when you fold the lines, A to B is shorter, they can even collide. For it's time, a line so narrow, past the future, straight as an arrow. Simple way, from one day to the next, a journey taking us from birth to death. There are 7 levels, levels to the universe. 2, 4, to travel to a 3. 7 levels, 7 down to the first. 2, 5, jump to another 4. Split in the line, back to the future, a wrinkle in time. This is how it's always gone. We choose from 5 for the 4 we're on. There are 7 levels, levels to the universe. 2, 5, travel to a 4. 7 levels, 7 down to the first. Through 6 to jump to another 5. Change reality if we wanted to live in the world where JFK was never murdered 6 a bit away. 7's all a singularity, simultaneous, every possibility, every yes and every no. Eternity, infinity, impossible to know. There are 7 levels, levels to the universe. 7 is infinity, a formless 4. 7 down to the first. Things get interesting here in 4. There are 7 levels, levels to the universe. 7 is infinity, a formless 4. 7 levels, from 7 down to the first. Things get interesting here in 4.
Hi, it's Rob Bryanton, and this is my video blog entry for November 14th, 2007 for Imagining the 10th Dimension. As I usually try and say at the start of these shows, if you're watching right now at 10thdimension.com/chat, you're probably watching a pre-recorded show, but the text that's scrolling down underneath me is being generated live, and which means that anybody who's watching the show can have that become part of what other people who are watching the video right now in the nature of reality. The idea I'm exploring today then is whether we can say God is in the 7th dimension. And before those of you who support the Richard Dawkins concept of God is a dangerous idea that we should all try to suppress as much as possible because it has been responsible for too many bad things in history, all I'm really trying to do is get to the point where we can acknowledge that God is part of this way of imagining reality. I'm not saying it's the proof that God does exist. I'm not saying it's the proof that God doesn't exist. I'm saying this is another way of thinking about it, and what we're trying to do is find a way to fit all the various truths of what somebody wrote into the chat window, saying that I was taking the ideas of Richard Dawkins and completely subverting them. Richard Dawkins, of course, developed the concept of memes in the first place, and a meme being an idea that has a shape in time and space, a beginning and an ending, an idea that can be transmitted across time and space with no dilution. Richard Dawkins came up with that idea. I'd say right now, as we're becoming more and more connected together through Google and through Wikipedia and the internet, memes are becoming something that it gets easier and easier to track as it rises and falls. But if you're thinking in a multi-dimensional way, as we've been encouraging people to do here, It's just another pattern. Another way that you could be watching this is just at 10thdimension.tv. If you'd just like to sit back and watch the show without participating in the conversations, that's another way to watch it. If you'd like to explore some of the other ideas that are peripheral to this, if you're at 10thdimension.com/chat, this is Amiibo window, which means over to the right, anybody who posts a YouTube link or a link to a website, that becomes part of the thumbnails over to the right. If you've already seen this show, or if you're sick of hearing me blab on, go ahead and turn the volume down on me in this left-hand window and talk about some of the things that are happening over to the right. So the blog entry that I'm going to read you today is actually in response to now wherever they're watching it, it becomes part of that. And we do check the logs from time to time. I'm going to refer a little bit later in this particular program to some of the stuff that's been posted to the chat logs in the last week. But the reason I mentioned that there are other ways to watch this show is because if you're at ustream.tv, for instance, there's also a chat that's happening there. That doesn't get incorporated into the video that we're watching, but it does get viewed from the 10thdimension.com/chat window, so people can actually talk back and forth between those two or comment on what each other are saying between those two. It's a very multi-dimensional way to be able to exchange these ideas back and forth, and I hope people enjoy playing with those ideas.